Trump versus Clinton, the first face-to-face showdown is finally here. And Newsmax TV has got it covered with live expert analysis. Watch our special presidential debate coverage on Monday beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern. Watch it with the Newsmax app.
And we are looking forward to that. But looking back at the past week, suffice it to say, it has been hectic. Last weekend, the terror bombing in New York and then the subsequent manhunt for Ahmed Rahami. The past 3 nights have not been any quieter, as in Charlotte, North Carolina, violent protests have filled the streets during the evening hours. Police around the nation have had a difficult job this past week, and we're going to examine it from all angles. To do that, we're pleased to be joined by former CIA analyst and the Vice President for the Center for Security Policy, Fred Fleitz, who is center screen right there. Screen left is Garland Nixon, radio talk show host and retired Maryland police major. And screen right, my old pal from Capitol Hill, Pete Hoekstra, former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee and the Shillman Senior Fellow at the Investigative Project on Terrorism. Pete's most recent book is entitled Architects of Disaster, The Destruction of Libya. Pete and Fred, we will get to you in just a moment, but I'd like to begin exclusively with Garland Nixon. Garland, we really do appreciate your time, and it's worth noting there have been many calls for the police in Charlotte to release the body camera video and the dash cam video during the episode involving the fatal shooting of Keith Scott. But earlier today, Charlotte Police Chief Kerr Putney addressed reporters.
So the intent is to get it out and release it in a package so that it can be consumed and fully understood. If I were to put it out indiscriminately and it doesn't give you good context, it can inflame the situation and make it even worse. It will exacerbate the backlash. So it's not that I want to hide anything, it's I want to be more thoughtful and deliberate in delivering the whole story.
So while the Charlotte police want to release it in their own time, turns out Keith Scott's widow has made available cell phone video. She gave this through her attorneys to the New York Times. In the video, Scott's wife tells police Scott doesn't have a gun, even though it is not clear from subsequent conversation and narration of this video that he did not have the gun. I could see this video's exposure actually prompting more people to take to the streets in Charlotte. Do you believe that will be the case, Garland?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think the social dynamic that we're dealing with now is bigger than just Charlotte. The anxiety and the frustration that a lot of people in the black community are feeling is, related to what happened directly in that community. People have talked about, there are people coming from out of town, and it's because it is a nationwide anxiety, and I don't think that one little bit of video released by the widow of the victim is going to make things worse. I do think that the sooner they release the video, the better, because, as they say in Washington here, it's never the crime, it's the cover-up, and a lot of the anxiety is about feeling that there won't be justice or there won't be transparency afterwards. And
so even with subsequent judicial proceedings, you believe that the Charlotte police chief should go ahead and get the video out as soon as possible?
If it is legal to release the video, which apparently it is, I think they should. I think it's in the best interest of the community to release the video.
Fair enough. Garland, one other question, because you talk politics from time to time on your radio program, and that may be an understatement. Here's the situation.
Exactly.
Here's the situation. Tulsa, there was a shooting there. Nobody took to the streets. Now, it's true that Tulsa police have charged that officer with manslaughter. They moved expeditiously. But Charlotte, everybody in the streets for 3 nights, 70% of the people arrested from outside North Carolina coming in, apparently to take part in the rioting. Was there a political angle in Charlotte because it's a critical state for both sides in the electoral battle coming up?
Not at all. These issues aren't really related to politics. If you look at the people who are involved in a lot of the protests, who are involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, it kind of reminds me of Occupy, in that there are a lot of young people who actually are angry and frustrated over politics, who aren't really thrilled about participating in the political system. So I would say my experience in working with these people is it's the opposite. There are a lot of people, young people now, who probably maybe not even show up to vote because they're upset with kind of the status quo of politics.
Garland Nixon tonight from Newsmax Washington. Garland, we always appreciate your insights and analysis. Now, with the time remaining, let's turn to Fred Fleitz and Pete Hoekstra. Gentlemen, we heard the chief from Charlotte saying he wanted to hold off to get a better idea of what happened. That similar notion is expressed by Milwaukee Sheriff David Clark. Here is what he wrote in an op-ed for The Hill. He wrote, quote, "We need to use a war model to prosecute this campaign, and instead we're using a law enforcement model which seeks probable cause to arrest, a very high standard, oftentimes not achievable until after an attack crime occurs, and then enough evidence that will stand up in a court of law." Close quote. Let me transition that here because we're not talking really about the Charlotte situation. We're now talking about an area which you gentlemen are very familiar with, and that is the case of the terror bomber in New York. The distinction that Sheriff Clark makes concerning an act of war as opposed to a criminal action. Fred Fleitz, your take on that?
Well, I think when we're talking about what happened in New York, we are talking about an act of war. We're talking about someone who was collaborating with a foreign terrorist organization. And I think that the suspect should be treated as someone who committed an act of war against the United States and tried appropriately.
Pete, we have talked about this before. When we're a nation at war, we have to apply the rules of war, including enemy combatants. And of course, the FBI apparently was slow or investigated Rahami even after his dad called him and said, "Look, my son is a terrorist." Are there reasons our FBI's investigative process needs critical scrutiny at this juncture?
Well, JD, I don't think it's only the FBI. Number one, for the FBI, we need to take a look at exactly how many cases they're investigating at this point in time. I think Director Comey recently said, "I've got ongoing investigations in all 50 states. That means the FBI may be overwhelmed, but we also need to take a look at what's happening with our intelligence community. You know, do we have the relationships overseas with the Pakistani intelligence, with the Afghan intelligence, with other crucial countries where these organizations have resources, but where these countries, if they are our allies, they would have real insights. You know, did the Pakistanis, did the Afghan intelligence organizations report to the United States, or did we ask them for help in tracking this guy when he was in Quetta for 9 months on his trips to Pakistan and Afghanistan to get an insight, to check with their sources among these radical jihadist groups? Hey, is there an American there? What's going on? Did they give us a tip? We need to strengthen all of these areas.
About a minute remains, and you mentioned the travel which Mr. Rahami engaged in to Pakistan, elsewhere. Now, it turns out his wife left the country just days before these bombs went off. It's now reported that she has returned to the United States. And as we look at this, first to you, Fred Fleitz, and I'll get you to weigh in on it too, Pete, about 20 seconds each. Do you believe our intelligence agencies, while she was off American soil, should have subjected her to thorough interrogation away from these shores? Very quickly, Fred.
I think some type of intense interrogation would have been warranted. I'm worried about ISIS ties.
What about it, Pete? The whole thing, we had our colleague, former colleague Porter Goss, former head of the CIA, on this program earlier this week. He said he hoped while she was off of American soil, there would be strenuous interrogation. 15 seconds for you.
You got a couple things you got to consider. Number one, the host government would have to allow us to take her into custody. Number two, the Senate and Congress have put in very strict guidelines for exactly the interrogation procedures that we can now use.
Fair enough. Gentlemen, we will continue our friendly interrogation. That just really means asking and answering questions. More with Fred Fleitz and Pete Hoekstra, plus Texas Congressman Brian Babin. That's next on Newsmax Prime.